Well, it's Friday. It's after 5 o'clock on a Friday here in the East Coast. Wherever you are, I will grant you my 5 o'clock-ness. So that would be fine. Welcome back after a little break. If you can hear, I'm a little bit stuffed up with the head cold. And I'm still recovering a little bit. Not COVID. Of course, that's our world now. Anytime you have some kind of a head cold, you got to take the check of the test of the thing and the whatever. And I've never heard so many normal people start being familiar with false positives and false negatives. And that was actually on an old episode of Ask PerfBytes that we did with Brian about what is the difference between a false positive and a false negative. Pre-pandemic, I think I used like a legal jury, the criminal is found guilty and goes free. The analogy is not as good as now as saying it's like taking a COVID test. You don't have COVID, but the test says you do, or the other way around. So now everyone knows what that is. My name is Mark Tomlinson. I was just on the thing. Look, I can put that on there again. No, did that go? There you go. That's me, the chief performacologist here at PerfBytes. And a shout out this afternoon to Scott Moore and James Pulley, who are doing something that looks rather wild, is the only thing I will say. And if you know Scott Moore Consulting in the SMC Journal, he's been doing all sorts of stuff on the YouTube channel for the Performance Tour, so you go check it out. And you can see him. Just go look Scott Moore Consulting or look up SMC Journal and Performance Tour, and you're going to see really, really funny videos. And of course, Scott's doing a bang-up job. He's still got that. He's doing such an amazing job at actually producing the video content, more than I am, where I just take 2 weeks off because I'm sick. And I work a full-time job. But anyway, today's topic is going to be tips for database observability. At least I have three that I was in a conversation this week on a different thing with my DBA team, and then it actually linked to another thread I was on with somebody talking about tracing. And of course, this topic should go all the way over to Henrik's Is It Observable channel. You can, if you're watching this right now, you can chat me real time. I'm not imbibing anything. I have a thing of water here, so I'm drinking water. It's got some kind of a flavor thing in it, blueberry-ish kind of thing, which is cool. But that's where I am now. A shout out to our sponsors, of course. Give a thanks to them if you haven't visited their websites recently. Go out and see what's happening. You know, it's the summertime. Things are maybe a little bit chill, not cool from a temperature standpoint because the planet is heating. But, you know, you could go check out our sponsors like Tricentis. Tricentis does a fantastic job with our old partners, Flood.io and Neoload. So a shout out to the Tricentis world. And there's some really cool people who are working that I didn't even know are working now at Tricentis. Show a shout out to all the cool people that are working at Tricentis that are there. Not just Sebastian and some of these other cool people that ended up from Flood or from these other places. But yeah, that's pretty cool. Tricentis.com. Neoload and Flood.io are a perfect matchup for if you're going after load testing in the cloud or whatever. The Catchpoint APM, and I've been pushing a lot the web page test because Tim and Henry and some of the folks for the web page test world, they have done some really, really cool user interface things. If you haven't checked out the latest versions of web page test, and of course the greater Catchpoint APM umbrella, I'll say. Umbrella of products from Catchpoint. Check that out if you can. And then, of course, Folk Consulting and Ryan Folk and Folk Consulting. They're just a bunch of really nice people, very cool, nice people who have some expertise, consulting services-wise, to help you implement things like Neoload, implement things like a Dynatrace. They probably know Catchpoint APM, Flood.io. They know a lot of these things because they've been in the space for so long with that expertise. So Ryan Folk at Folk Consulting, you can give him a shout out. It's the weekend. He would love to hear from you. So, you know, just shoot him an email. Hey, Ryan, how's it going? Call him up, take him out to lunch. Don't let him take you out to lunch. Take him out to lunch. Just turn the tables. Keep things interesting. Abstracta, one of the last Biggest videos I've done this year is on JMeter, the JMeter DSL, the testing DSL with Roger. And we're going to come back and do some other stuff. So if you go back and look at that video, if you have any questions, great comments, tons of people take a look at that. And you'll see Abstracta now kind of launching this ability to build JMeter scripts in Java. So check out that old video. But Abstracta does a lot of other amazing things. They have a tool called Aptim. They have general consulting services with amazing performance and development expertise. If you're doing performance in DevOps, boy, check out these two great consulting. Scott does advising on that. Ryan Folkville Consulting. If you are pulling DevOps, getting performance into DevOps early in the life cycle, Abstracta might be a good partner for you to check out as well. So special thanks to our sponsors here in the summertime of 2022, where I would like to talk about tips for database observability. And I'll give the caveat on this conversation. The conversation with this other person I was talking to, who I haven't checked with them whether I can disclose their name or anything, so they'll just be other person. Dave. It's not Dave, but we'll say it's Dave. Dave and I were chatting about, old school database monitoring. All right, I've got some fantastic tools for database monitoring. One of the tips was DB Marlin. That was from Scott Moore, who's got DB Marlin. It's great. Appears to be a really great tool. And there have been a few great ones over the years. One of them used to be called Ignite. It's now Solarwinds Database Performance Analyzer. And we, where I work, we use Solarwinds DPA. It's really, really cool tool. It's almost like you don't have to go digging. That's the worst thing about some of these products. You just have to, if you're unfamiliar with the complexities or the breadth, this is not a ding to Dynatrace, but Dynatrace, New Relic, Datadog, they're competing in a space that is so vast. It's really hard to narrow things down and get something done. Well, that's the nice thing about database monitoring. You could just go into a tool like DPA or something like that. And it's the focus or the context is smaller, so it's easier to get in and see, I can look at blocking, I can look at latching, I can look at deadlocking, I can look at performance issues and things is really nice. And so the conversation with Dave was, how everyone's talking about observability. And it seems like all the performance people I follow are moving over into the observability space. You got Henrik doing the Is It Observable? There's some SRE stuff. Our friend Stephen Townsend's doing stuff with SRE in his show and podcast. So, and he's like, what do you think about this? Are these tools that are trying to talk about database observability? And I'm like, if tip number one is that your DBA, the culture of a DBA team, back in siloed IT, you could have a transaction go into that database, like a mainframe, and it's a black box. So the idea that we need to do tracing of stuff inside there, when we moved to client server, the old way of doing that was, there's a separate team with separate tools that do their own monitoring of everything going on in there. And I really thought about it. I'm like, to be honest, some of those tools that are tracing, monitoring every stored procedure call, every breakdown of every execution plan. If you have parallelism in execution, of course, your parallelism, if you have an SNMP, a NUMA-aware SNMP box, well, guess what? That SNMP box has multiple schedulers running lots of queries in parallel, and you really draw out I'm going to go to the camera like this. If you really draw out, here's my app over here, and it's going to make a call into this amorphous blob called a database, right? And the idea that I would have a span that's running, and of course I have a trace maybe that goes into this app, and there's some traces before and such, but I need to have a span that can trace into the database. Now, modern web-friendly database technologies can do this because they can look at things like individual requests and share. In the old days, there's really a database is a database system. If I think about RDBMS, right? RDBMS. And you could have multiple file data stores out the back. So you've got, multiple disks and database running in parallel. Maybe there's a whole system. I like to draw things out like I have sort of some cache manager, I have some sort of buffer manager, I have kind of an IO storage plane in the back end, I've got sort of a query processor, cost optimization engine, etc. I've got a raw, let's say a raw engine itself that coordinates all of these pieces happening, and they run on like, another SQL kernel or something like that. Maybe the profiling engine happens in here. Who knows what? There's all these different components, but if you've got to trace in, trace ID 1. So this entire database is doing, maybe it's breaking a plan in parallel, and you've got really thousands of requests going into this database. Each one of them, if you were to tag each of them, like the classic RDBMSs, I'm not 100% up to speed on how SQL or Oracle or DB2 are doing this, but for the most part, they're already tagged. Like you have a PID, a process, a SPID. You've got multiple IDs for the queries that are running in parallel against the storage, in the storage engine while they're running through the query process. So there's already the individual IDs. Like a database system, when I think about it, is even though it's running potentially on one machine or a cluster of machines, it's really one thing. Inside it is a whole system that's, how do I make that single entity called a database? How do I open it up and make it transparent so I can start seeing that stuff? And one of the tips I had was, if you're kind of stuck trying to figure out how to, if you've got a database team, it's like, we've got our own tools, we know how this works. One of the things you'll see you're probably already doing is you have something like a custom, let's say, request ID as an actual field on a parameter that goes in, and you could query then in a log table that request ID. Well, you could tag that in the system so that you've got trace IDs that are out here. Well, trace ID 1, 2, 3, 4 actually relates to request ID, and the request ID is what's, what happened inside that. But you're not really tracing the SPID or the processor that's happening inside those systems, which is why that's really hard to actually say, well, how much time did I spend doing buffering? How much time did I spend in the cost optimization engine? How much did I spend in the IO storage engine? How much did I spend on the wire from the kernel getting to a disk and back? And being able to trace down where inside the RDBMS, most DBAs would just look at you and laugh. It was like, don't concern your pretty head. You stay out here in app land, and we'll use really cool, sophisticated tools, built-in tools, DMVs, right? Dynamic management views in SQL, or ways to actually manage everything happening in here. But we don't necessarily tag externally doing that. So one of the challenges or the tips I have for you is try to leverage your existing sort of tracing or tagging or request tracking that's already in your database schema and correlate that back to an actual observability trace ID. And try to bridge the gap between, I'll say, the old and the new, where in the front end you could be ingesting from external partners, their W3 trace IDs from OpenTelemetry into your own set of trace IDs and correlating these things so that in a single repro you can actually track that kind of stuff. Now, if you're running, say, a modern Mongo, or you're running a time series database that's more open, I know Influx can do this. I think I haven't looked at the Memer stuff enough, but like if Prometheus is usually performance time series related stuff, but you can actually trace right into those things. You could even add the trace ID as a tag automatically within the system. So think of the database system as it's already a system of microservices with all its components, but you don't really have tagging or tracing on the span that happens inside the black box. So try to correlate it back to an actual request ID. I think Alexa is trying to talk to me over here. I'm going to turn it down to a red there. We're playing around with Dynatrace actually, and Davis. So leverage your existing request IDs, or that's the first tip. The second thing I'll say is that these spans and traces are are their own queries. What am I writing here? Hang on. So they don't correlate all the way into that. If you're not tracing into that black box from an observer, the database as a black box, there may be ways to, as you're logging things out of here, having your logging tables do some, not all, but some of its logging into the database using that request ID, or using a request ID that you can correlate back out to a trace ID. My next tip is that understand the process for observability is still fueling root cause analysis and problem identification without having to do additional egregious steps in order to figure out what's gone wrong with a particular query. The nice thing about the tools, a Datadog, a Honeycomb, a Dynatrace, Catchpoint, is that you have a bunch of rich information that happens out here on the front end, and I'm going to switch colors, where you could see individual stored procedure calls, let's say A, B, C, D, E, and you can see your core metrics from the outside in on latency, number of requests, and getting that kind of work done. If you do nothing more than work within the APM tool to present to the SRE team or to the engineer that's doing the problem diagnosis, if you just present to them, here's the request ID, and I've even seen people do example SQL queries like select, like they actually write out in the APM tool, in the metadata, they don't just show, for store procedure D, they actually put in the text of a select statement so you could go plop that request ID into a SQL prompt and boom, get all the information you need about what was happening on that. I still think though, you're still not looking at the internals of why something ran slow. Was it bottlenecked at some component within that RDBMS, which is cool. But it's a way to make it easier for an engineer to say, hey, I've kind of come to the front door of this amorphous thing called a database. Can I break this down and see more about that? Using the request ID values and variables plus the tracing ID, you could see, all right, before I pick up the phone and call the database person and say, what the heck happened with request D, all the way through this, and then here's store procedure D ends up putting n number of records on the back end way over here before it came back. They'll go back in time in their database tools and say, aha, at such and such time, boom, we saw this number of queries go up, etc., or there was latching, blocking, locking, anything of the piece, anything that slows down these transactions from happening in parallel. We had I/O congestion on a couple of these networks, and that meant we used failed over to something, etc., etc. So they're going to give you higher level, not specific traces, higher level things to figure that stuff out. So 1, leverage your variables and put variables in there. 2, a database system kind of is its own internal tracking, so you could look at SPIDs if you had the default traces running, default profiling, I think it's a default trace that's running in some of that RDBMS. They are going to log out hey, what happened at such and such time, and they would look at this SPID got blocked by this, was stuck in an I/O wait, this one had latency on a CPU wait, this one was just crunching, this one was idle blocked on another thing. So the reason for tracing inside that RDBMS, it already has its own information. You just need to figure out the time frame wise. That's the other tip, I think, generally. It's not really good. It's like an old monitoring piece. It's just the same time frame from start time to end time. When we go look in the database, one of the convenient things I do at the end of a load test is I actually parse out the start of the test, the end of the test, or even an interval within there, a ramp up, steady state, ramp up, steady state. So I actually have different timestamps at those intervals. And then I'll actually statically parse out a URL and stick it in my test results. It'll end up on a Jira ticket or something. So you could easily roll that into a link to go into the RDBMS. So, open up this page in SQL DPA is one I do. If you have a web-based interface to go look at what's happening in the database, just do your DBAs a favor, get all the information you need to do, roll a roll a URL, parse out and create a URL, a URI string, and then just put it in the problem notification. Put it in an alert that says, hey, DBAs, at this time frame, exactly, go look in X, Y, and Z. They will thank you a little bit. Maybe, if you're lucky. That'd be good. The last thing I'll say is these it's very, very common that from data teams that they're not free and flexible to adapt all the new cool tooling we do, the auto instrumentation that we have, or instrumentation frameworks or observability and tracing that you would see happening in the app layers, plus distributed microservices and things like that. Have a heart. These databases, for compliance reasons, for security reasons, whatever, they're in a tremendous amount of pressure. There's a reason that this system is sort of kept isolated. The tools that they use, my guys at the team, they use SQL DPA. They use, I think SolarWinds has SentryOne is a great tool. But if you're using DB Marlin or using the built-in management for your RDBMS, the culture of that team is kind of isolated for a reason. And it could be for security, data security, privacy, things that we all value, things that are very important to the company, but also to individual customers or users. So understand these teams are built to like, hey, we don't really need to be tracing stuff out to the world of, hey, how much time did you spend in the IO storage controller inside your X, Y, and Z of the RDBMS talking to, we're going to keep not just the data itself, but also the metadata and performance metrics about our database kind of private. It's going to be totally stuck because it's a can of worms. The minute you start sharing a little bit of that information, people start asking questions. Next thing you know, we got a huge can of worms. We're not going to do that. So do the best you can in tips of getting things in and out from the front end. Know what stored procedures you might be calling. Know how much time you're spending. And then in your test results, try to build that relationship by making it easier. Hey, are you guys using a tool? Let me roll a URL so whenever we start troubleshooting or diagnosing something, we can actually just make it easier in the alert for you to go, huh? And I can click on that and it opens up SQL DPA and I can see, oh yeah, no, there were 4 sessions blocked. That thing was waiting on another thing, and maybe the tuning AI says you're missing an index, or we recommend a different index here or there, which would be very cool. I'm gonna go back over here. So really simple tips as to, if you have the luxury of a beautiful web-friendly, observability-friendly data source and it has tracing all the way down inside there, good for you. If you're not, that might be cool, but you have a tremendous amount of learning to do because how data moves in and out of even modern systems can be overwhelming, and you still have plenty of things to work out on the front end of your system as well. So thank you. Those are my simple kinds of tips, or at least a small, short talk, a brief talk about database observability, or at least data. I'll call it data source observability. Some of them are a black box, and some of them are not. But how to at least think about. We've done all this great tracing on the front end, and we got stuff coming into the app layers, and we got these great tools, sophisticated or DIY, building kind of stuff in the middle tier. How do I put it all together when it comes to actually monitoring and tracing into or tracing around the edge of a database call, of a database RDBMS, a system, and correlate that in there. Thank you guys for joining me. Have a fantastic weekend. It's a little bit short. I'm sorry I missed you for 2 weeks. We're going to be back. PerfBytes is, again, James is off doing some stuff. I really want to drag us back into the Ask PerfBytes will become the Ask Me Anything things we've been doing monthly. We missed one, but Henrik and Leandro are doing fantastic stuff. Leandro's got a news program over in K6, which is hilarious. Hilarious only because it looks like a real cable news program, like very nicely done. The other thing I wanted to shout out, events-wise, things that are coming up, still have some Cloveros training in the next couple of weeks. It's either, I think, the end of July or beginning of August. So in 2 weeks, 1 week or 2 weeks. So if you want to do an intro to performance with me, It's a 2 long days virtual training. You can join me. Just go check out, do like performance workshop at coveros.com. I have a couple of those. I think 2 more throughout the rest of the fall here, which is really great. Speaking of performance workshops, not to let the cat out of the bag, I think there will be a call for papers coming for the next Whopper workshop on performance and reliability. If you follow Abstracta and Federico, Fede's kind of tipped it a little bit that we might be going down to their Uruguay. I'm going to totally bastardize the saying of that. So apologies to everyone that knows how to properly speak Spanish and say Uruguay. Workshop on performance and reliability. I was talking to my colleague Justin today about the history of this great small peer workshop that dives super deep into performance. And the topic generally, I think, is around, I think it was like sprints or agile or maybe iterative performance work of any kind. And so check out, I think it's performance-workshop.org, but look up the Whopper. It's a workshop on reliability, on performance and reliability. If you follow Eric Pregler as well, or Mace Taufik, there's some great, fantastic folks. I think our content owner is Andy. It's a great community of stuff. Stephen Townsend, I met him through the Whopper down in New Zealand, which is great. So you might see us advertising or talking a bit about the Whopper, which is one of the communities we talk. The other thing I'll mention is I think I saw Richard Bradshaw mention there's a test bash code function with a code, test bash code. I did one last year. I think it was in the fall or maybe even before that, which was on the test harness that I use, the influx stuff. So look for tools. It's all test bash tools, test bash function, semicolon, which is I have no idea how you say that as a conference name out loud. So, but go to the Ministry of Testing website and check out the test bash, test automation, functional, function thingy, semicolon. And I don't know if I'm going to submit, maybe I should submit, but I've already kind of done one. And so I'm just going to promote that. And if you have something cool you're doing with your own test automation, or you want to do a particular tool, hey, even our sponsors, those guys should get out there. I think Roger, if Roger is looking at this, he should totally do the Java DSL thing. Not to just promote Abstracta doing that, because it's open source. And it's a great way to hey, we have all these great JMeter scripts. Can we just get our devs to work on them in Java? So test bash, open parentheses, close parentheses. It's just too hard to say that. I'm sorry, can't do it. Have a fantastic weekend, everyone. Stay cool out there if you can. Plant milkweed pods to save the monarch butterflies. Don't use glyphosate in your yard to save the bees. Don't get an electric car, or just don't drive if you don't have to drive. Use a bicycle. You might need the exercise anyway, so walk or do something to stay cool, because I think this is a summer that people are, I hope, maybe paying attention to. Things are getting really hot. I will tell you that if unfortunately the sea level rise goes up, we calculated 66 feet. I live north of Philadelphia, and I would have oceanfront property, and that scares me. I'm not into that. If it comes up 66 feet, that would be very, very. There were a lot of people not doing well. So yeah. Thanks very much. We'll see you guys on the next PerfBytes. Ciao.